Now, we know that the global economy is in flux, partly because of the conflict in the Persian Gulf, others call it the Arabian Gulf. And one of the things that we know for certain, even though, of course, we are not too sure about the magnitude, is that the petroleum prices are going to rise, and they're going to rise substantially. Now, Kenya has a history, or rather first, petroleum is important as an important energy source in several sectors. But at the same time, it's a common consumption item in Kenyan households for cooking, in some cases for providing electricity, for transport, and that. What this means is that we have pressures, including discussions by Kenyans about what will happen if petrol prices go beyond what is affordable. And that brings us to the political side. We already hear conversations, some of course asked of us, what will government do if the conflict in the Persian Gulf, which is spreading and which is deepening in terms of its escalation and intensity, what happens if it continues to grow? I mean, if it gets worse. And a common economic policy response by governments at such times is to try and impose price controls, arguing that price controls help citizens, help local farms, but also helps the households that are vulnerable from price rises, escalation of prices, and obviously preserves the ability to afford essential goods and services. So Kenya has not just a history of price controls, but we also have we have awareness that price controls are considered an important economic policy tool. And so today, we are examining not just whether price controls are a good economic policy tool, but we're going to do that by looking at the history, talking about what the theory says in economics, which is very, very clear. And after that, ask ourselves empirically whether price controls are a good way. And price controls basically is just an imposition of a price point by government upon which either purchasers cannot buy beyond or cannot buy below and all that. And it's available in many sectors in Kenya, in addition to the fact that it's enabled by law. So we see conversations around the country asking ourselves whether this would be the right time or how price controls should be imposed. I think it's a good question and it's a good conversation to have at this critical moment. So I have today my colleague, and the name is Vivian Ochola, who works in the Popular Economics Program, whose function principally is to expand public understanding of how a modern economy works, to help people to understand and situate the economic challenges that Kenya has and what the most efficient responses should be from the government of Kenya and policymakers in general, but also to let Kenyans appreciate the roles and both to appreciate the rules, but also how market economy is beneficial, or how markets and economic science tells us markets would be useful for enhancing our welfare. So at this conversation, and Vivian will be making a presentation for just about half an hour, going through the stuff that I've spoken about, with a comparative analysis as well, and thereafter take judgment about it. So I'd welcome you, and I'd just ask us to remind ourselves a couple of rules. So the IEA records these conversations, and the reason for recording these conversations is essentially for archival purposes and reference, because many people sometimes are not able to attend at this moment and this day, and so it can be used for public education more broadly. For that reason, if you do not wish for us to include you or to include questions or any conversation that you had with us, please let us know in advance. But we'd like you to be informed that, yes, we consider this a public event in which conversations will be had, and those conversations will be placed on the record. So if you wish for any reason not to be, that will be first important for us to allow us to read. And the second point is we will keep to ensure that the conversation proceeds without interruption for the first 30 minutes. My colleague Vivian will project, of course, the presentation that you already see, but we'll ask you all to keep your microphones and your cameras switched off. And thereafter, then we'll open up our session for question and answer, at which we can have a discussion and we can make your comments or ask specific questions related to this subject or to the discussion that we've had today. And basically, the final one is that we have On the top of the floating bar is a question and answer and a chat box, in which if you have questions as the presentation is going ahead, please do send your questions there and we'll try to answer them or align them up and ask them of Vivian upon the conclusion of the first presentation. So once again, the Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank, and we're glad that you're here. Our work is to carry out research and have public dialogues on topical issues affecting Kenya, the region, and the globe. And we are here as part of basically this conversation, and we're glad that you're here. We thank you for honoring us by attending this. So I'll ask Vivian to proceed with the conversation. Vivian, please welcome.
Thank you very much, Kwame. I hope you can hear me clearly. So thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Now, today, we want basically to challenge a common claim or a common belief that price controls protect consumers. That's why we have our title, Why Price Controls Are Always a Bad Economic Policies. Then, this is our outline. What is price control? We'll understand the definition, then claims and the legal basis. Then we'll also see the goods that are under price control under the Act in Kenya, then the economic effects on the market, the political economics of price control. Then we look at the conclusions and the recommendations. Now, let us start by answering what is price control. So price control basically means government policies that aims to regulate prices of goods and services. So this shows us that government sometimes do set limits and also standards or based on price instead of letting markets to decide. So price control is when a government decides to set limits on prices of goods and services in a market. So it happens in two ways. That is through price ceiling and also price floor. So price ceiling is when the government set a certain price that producers should not sell below a certain price. Then we have the price floor. So this is where the government decides to set a certain price, a minimum price. So the producers should not sell below that given price. So price ceiling is when which it caps prices. Then price floors is when the government set minimum prices for goods and services. So there are claims about the value of price control. So the first claim is basically in the Price Control Act under Section 1B, it claims that the price controls makes essential goods affordable. So when they set a certain price that is below the market price, it makes goods affordable. Then to protect consumers during crisis. So when there's a crisis, the government tend to set prices so that they protect consumers. Those are the claims. So we'll see whether those claims are true and justifiable. Then also to stabilize the market. Now, these are just illustrations of those claims. So this is an illustration from Vanuatu. So they claim, there was a claim that new price limits are intended to protect consumers. So basically, always when a price is set or when there's price control, it is connected to consumer protection. So you'll be able to identify by the end of this presentation whether these two are related or whether one leads to another. So there's always a claim that price controls or price limits tend to protect consumers, and we can see that in these pictures. And this one is in Kenya. So these are news from Vellum News. So they state that there's a balancing act where consumer protection and supporting domestic manufacturer in the price control. So there's always a connection that price controls protect consumers. So you'll be able to see if that is applicable, if that is true. Now, let us see the legal claim for price control. So we have two key legislations that claim price control is okay. So if you look at the Price Control in bracket Essential Goods Act that was revised in 2024, it was there initially in 2011. It was later revised in 2024 under Section 1B. So it says that the government is given the mandate or the authority under this act to set prices of essential goods and services to protect consumers. So that is a claim. Then also under Energy Act 2019, under Section 10(o), it also gives EPRA the authority to set charges for petroleum. So we are going to see those examples and identify whether these are good key legislation or what effects do they have in the market. Now, since we have seen that price control is always connected to consumer protection, so we want to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Does this have a constitutional foundation? Because the Constitution allows the government to protect consumers, to protect their social and economic rights, and also to ensure fair trade. But does protection of consumers means setting price? So one thing we need to know is that the government is not mandated to control prices under the Constitution. So that should be clear. The government is not mandated under the Constitution to control prices because there's no constitutional foundation for price control. So this is just popular when there's a crisis or when there's a challenge in the economy, but it is not founded in the Constitution. So the Constitution only allows for consumer protection, and protection can be through safety standards, ensuring that goods and services that are provided in the market are of quality, but it does not give the government ground to control prices. So it is a mistake when it is interpreted that consumer protection means controlling prices. They do not go together. Now, let us see, under the Act, the Price Control Act, Section 2A, it gives us a list of goods that are under or are subjected to price control, especially when there's a crisis. And we are able to see the list. So the list here, we have maize and maize flour, wheat and wheat flour. Then we have rice, cooking oil, sugar, drugs, and also fuel and fuel products. So if you look at this list, it's majorly composed of food. Then we have fuel, and partly we have the drugs. So we remember that most Kenyans consume food and fuel. So they are trying in the act. It's trying to allows for control of prices of these goods that are essential to a Kenyan, that is food and also petroleum. So these are goods that when there's a crisis, and we are going to see some examples, when there's a crisis, they are subjected to price control. But this is good. Is this really good? We are going to note what effects does the price control have on the markets, both on the consumer and the supplier side. These are just illustrations. So this was in 2022 during election when there was a price, when the government said that prices of maize flour should not be sold above 100 shillings. So they placed a price ceiling. So any trader that was selling maize flour above 100 shillings was at a risk of paying a 1 million fine. So they were restricted to accept only prices that are below 100 shillings. Then we know every month, if you look at the image on the right, it shows us that every month there's a maximum retail prices that is produced by the EPRA for petroleum. So every month, EPRA produces maximum retail prices, petroleum prices in Kenya that applies to all petroleum stations in the country. So those are illustrations. So we are speaking of something that is real, and we are able to see in the images that it is happening both in the food and in the fuel sector. Now, let us see the economics, how we want to understand the effects of price control. But before we understand that, we need to know how does a market operate. So we have the chart on our left hand that tells us how a market operates if there are no price control. So we have the y-axis is the price, then the x-axis is the quantity demanded or supplied. Then the upward sloping line, that is the red line, it's the supply. Then we have the demand curve that is downward sloping. So the demand curve is downward sloping because we know very well how human beings or how human nature behaves is when prices are high, people tend to demand less of a particular good or a product. And when it comes to supply, when the prices are high, suppliers are incentivized to supply more of that product. That's what brings in the downward slopeness and also the upward sloping of the supply curve. Then at point PE and QE where they meet, that is the equilibrium point. So at this point, the market is operating efficiently. At this point, there's no excess supplies and there's no shortage. So the demand and the supply meet at this point. So this is and they result to an equilibrium price. So this is the best price to sell at the market. So the price where supply and demand meet. Then we see the shaded parts. So the shaded parts shows us the consumer surplus on the upper side. Then we have the blue shaded part, which shows us the producer surplus. So what is a consumer surplus? So a consumer surplus comes when a buyer is willing to buy at a certain amount, but find that particular good or service below the amount they are willing to buy. So for example, I go to a shop, I'm willing to buy a pair of shoes at 1,000 shillings. Then I find that shoes is 800 shillings. So the difference, that is 200 shillings, is my surplus, is the consumer surplus. So it brings the value, you get the value of that particular good or service. Then when it comes to producer surplus, so the amount the producer is willing to accept for a particular good or service produced or delivered to the market versus what they actually get. So when the producer is willing to receive 500 for a shoe, a pair of shoe, then as a buyer, I pay 800 shillings. So that 300 shillings is the producer surplus. So a market that is not interfered with through price controls operate in this way. So the consumer surplus and the producer surplus are at their maximum level. They are equal and the market is operating efficiently. Now let us come to this other side. So on this other side, we are able to see what happens when now we have the price control. So we still see the equilibrium at point. So let's assume the equilibrium price is at 45 shillings dollars at point B. Now, if there's a price ceiling, so at this point, when a price ceiling that is below the equilibrium, what happens is that it affects the producers are producing, but the prices are below the equilibrium price. So they are not incentivized. So their surplus is reduced. So what they are receiving versus what they could have received is lower. So their surplus is reduced. And this creates, and so before I look at the white part, so let us look at when there's a floor, for example, that is above the equilibrium. So when there's a floor that is a price floor that is above equilibrium, maybe at $50. So what happens? The prices are very high. So consumers, remember we say that when the prices are high, consumers tend to consume less of that particular product. So when they consume less of that particular product, it leads to a shortage or a reduced consumer surplus. Then we have this part that is white. So this is the dead weight loss. So this production that could have happened but does not happen. So because now the prices or the market is distorted as a result of price control. So we are able to see what price control does to the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. It creates a dead weight loss that is not recovered. Then now, this is just now the summary of what we have seen in the diagram. So what does price control do to the market? So when the prices, so P here represent the prices and we have the equilibrium. So when the prices are below the equilibrium, so the first thing we have seen, it distorts the market equilibrium, then it causes shortage in the market because producers will not be willing to produce at a lower price. Then it reduces the producer incentive. So the incentive of the producers are mostly the high prices in the market. So when the prices are below the equilibrium, so their incentives to produce more is reduced. Then it leads to black markets. So because now the prices are low, There's also shortage. Some people can decide now to, instead of following the rules and regulations, they decide to sell their products behind doors. So it leads to black market. Then also hoarding of goods and services. The producers may say now, because the prices are too low, we cannot sell at that price. We'll keep our goods until that time when the prices will arise. Then on the right side, what happens now when the prices are above the equilibrium? So when the prices are above the equilibrium, we are able to see, number one, that applies to all, it distorts the market. Then it causes surpluses, because now producers are incentivized to produce more, but the demand or the consumers, the prices are too high, they cannot purchase, so it causes surpluses. Then it shrinks the demand and also creates informal markets. So these are basically the summary of what we have seen in the chart. Then this now are individual economics illustrations of now the price ceiling and the price for what are the effects on the supply and the demand. So we have left the surpluses out. Now we want to shift our focus on what price ceilings does on the supply and on the demand side. So let us start with the price ceiling. So we have the supply curve, which is upward sloping, and the demand curve. Then we have the y-axis is the price, then the x-axis is the demand or the quantity demanded. So at point PE, that is the equilibrium point PE and QE. So that is when the market works best. So when there's a price ceiling, that most of the time is below the equilibrium price. So at this point, producers are banned from selling goods and services above price PC, point PC. We are able to see that. So at this point, they are banned to sell their goods above that particular price. And this price is below the equilibrium price. So what happens? So we see now the point at which the price PC meets the quantity demanded, the supply is low, but where it meets now, when the price PC now meets the quantity supplied is lower as compared where the price meets the quantity demanded. So what happens? It creates a shortage. So we are able to notice that when a price ceiling happens, when a price is set below the equilibrium price, it creates a shortage in the market. So between point QS and QD, that is a shortage that results because of the price ceiling. The same happens when we look now at the price floor, which is now above the equilibrium. So what happens? It leads to quantity glut or quantity surplus, the surplus in the market. So at this point, producers are willing to produce at point QS, while demand is at point QD. Because we noted earlier that when a price of a particular commodity goes high up, the demand for that good reduces. So we are able to see here that producers now are willing to produce because the prices are higher, it's favoring them, but the consumers, because the prices are higher, it leads to reduced demand. So the result now is the quantity surplus. So we are able to illustrate on the demand and the supply curves what price ceiling and price floor does. Let us see now the consequences in real life, because maybe the economics part may not explain the bigger picture, but now in real terms, these are consequences that we have seen, we have felt in one way or the other. So when the price is below the equilibrium, this is what happens. We have explained it now. It is illustrated in this image. So when the government decided that prices of unga should not go above 100 shillings. So the prices were below the equilibrium. So what happened? People were rushing, because we know in Kenya, most people consume ugali, that we use unga. So what happened? People were rushing to get the unga at that lower prices. And that led to people lining up long lines to get the unga. So there's no really value. Imagine you are going to the shop in the morning, getting back in the evening, maybe only have accessed one packet of unga. So it wasn't worth it. People are lining to get unga. And the same happened in Kenya when the prices of petroleum, there was there was we have seen that there's a price cap for petroleum. So when there was fuel shortage, people rushed to the petroleum stations, and because some markets or some petroleum station hoard their fuel, so it creates shortage. People go line up, they spend a lot of time. I remember those years when you could go to a petrol station, you could wait even for 3 hours to be served because fuel was not enough. So these are some of the effects. So these are in Kenya. Then we can see the global illustrations as well. So this is Venezuela. There was a shortage, empty supermarket shelves in Venezuela during a widespread shortage of food and medicine caused by price control. This was in 2018. Then this is also in Zimbabwe, where government price control, they realize that government price control are a sure path to market distortion. So we are able to see that. Then now, those were the consequences when the prices are below the market equilibrium. Now, what happens when the prices are above the market equilibrium? Remember, we said our prices are incentives to the suppliers. So when the prices are above equilibrium, what happens? They tend to produce more than the consumers are willing to demand. So we are able to see that in America, something happened. So we have cheese caves because Americans 1.2 billion pounds of hidden cheese. So there's excess production of hidden cheese in America to an extent that they have a hidden cave, 1.2 billion, that are not demanded. There's excess supply as a result of the high price. So the consumers are not able to buy the excess cheese. So they are hidden and they are stored somewhere. Then in India, there was also a challenge where this was in 2021. People are going hungry in India despite the massive grain supply. People going hungry because the consumers are incentivized because of high prices, but the consumers are not able to purchase those goods and services at that particular price. So they go hungry. Food is there, but they cannot afford it. So in turn, they are hungry despite of the massive surplus. Then to continue that, this was in North France. So we are seeing that French farmers give away potatoes due to overproduction. They're incentivized, they are producing more than what is demanded, and in result, some go into waste, some are given out. Then this was in Kenya, 2016, when the government did set a minimum price for maize. So the price that was set was above the equilibrium. And consumers were not able to purchase the maize stocks. And in result, the government purchased them, they stored them, and because there was no market for them, they ended up rotting. Imagine shillings, 1.1 billion shillings being wasted in maize that could have been released to the market at a fair prices and consumed by the citizens. So these are some of the consequences or the effects when prices are set either below or above the equilibrium. Let us see the political economy of price controls. So in this, we are going to understand something very important. So political incentives. So mostly price controls. If you look at the season they happen, especially in Kenya, they are normally a period when we are close to elections. Like in 2022, when the UNGA price control was set, they are normally set when we are close to elections. So the reason because it is political incentives. Governments respond to voters' pressure on high prices. So a candidate comes to your place, they say that, what do you want us to do? People say that, oh, the unga prices are high. If you want us to elect you, make sure the prices are low. So they end up responding to voters' pressure. So they do a visible action. They say, okay, you want the unga to be low. They decide to set it at a given price for their immediate political gain. If someone can give you unga at 90 bob instead of 120, now you can afford it, you'll vote for that particular person. So there'll be visible action, then there'll be immediate political gains. And this happens especially on silent goods, such as what we've seen on fuel and food. Then now the question comes, who bears the costs? Because if something that is not economically correct, there's a cost that is borne by someone. So who bears this cost? So in the short run, consumers may gain and say, oh, remember there's a period we bought unga for 90 shillings, we bought unga for 70 shillings. It may be a gain, it might be a gain, but is a shorter gain. And we know that from the illustrations we saw is that they rush to the supermarkets, to the shops, and what happens? There's shortage. They cannot get those unga and at that particular price. Then producers bear, or farms, they bear the losses because now they are forced to sell their products below the equilibrium price. So they end up bearing the losses. Then we saw the deadweight loss, production that should have happened but do not happen. So there's efficiency losses when there are price controls, and the spread it might be less, but it is visible. Then now we have seen price control does not protect consumers. So what are some of the policy alternatives? What should the government do? Number one, respect price mechanism. So both the citizens, who are the consumers, the producers, and even the government, should respect price mechanism, allow demand and supply to determine the prices and not set price control. Citizens should not pressurize the government to set price controls on particular goods and services. They should respect price mechanism. Then targeted cash transfer during shock. So when there's a shock, like when there's drought or when there's floods and famine. So what should happen is that the government should give cash transfers to people who are vulnerable so that they may be able to afford the food that is available. We saw sometimes back when there was a contrast that there are some places in Kenya where people were having excess food while others were dying of famine. So this is where the government should intervene, not by setting price, because even if you set a price, a minimum price, and someone does not have money to purchase it, it won't make sense. But if you target cash transfer during shock to people who are vulnerable, they'll be able to afford the food that is available at whatever price it is available at. Then funding inputs through extension. So the government should fund inputs through extension to increase the productivity of the farmers, and because we know that in Kenya almost 70% of the population depends on agriculture. So funding inputs through extension will be very relevant. It will support the supplier so that they do not produce at a higher cost, so that the goods may be available. So we see the policy alternative. So the first one applies to both consumer and producer and even the government. Then we have targeted that now increase the demand side, so it supports the demand side. Then funding the inputs will now support the supply side. So we have seen the policy alternative. So someone can ask then, should the government come or intervene in the market? There's instances where the government should intervene in the market, not to control prices, but when there's externalities. So externalities are basically spillover. They can be positive or negative. So when there's an externality, maybe a negative externality, the government should intervene so that people are not affected as a result of a particular production. Then monopolies, when there's a single seller and they tend to manipulate the consumers by setting high prices, and that the government should intervene in case of monopolies. Then when there's information asymmetry, so the government should ensure regulation, set standards and labeling so that the consumers are not deceived. Then another way or another place the government should intervene is when they are providing public goods. In this intervention, there's nowhere that says the government should set prices to protect consumers. So the interventions are only allowed in 4 instances: when dealing with externalities, that is the spillovers; when dealing with monopolies; information asymmetry; and also provision of public good. Then finally, to conclude, these are the conclusions we made. So price mechanisms are difficult to observe. You cannot really sit somewhere and observe how demand and supply operates. So the government do not have much information. So the market should be led to decide the forces of demand and supply to decide the price. So it is difficult to observe and to set prices. Then also price controls, they appear, they don't protect, but they may appear to protect. But we have seen the results. They distort the market, they reduce the supply, and they create a lot of hidden costs that may not be visible in the short run. Then price controls, they are less about economic efficiency. They don't help economically. They are more about political incentives. So we have seen that in our political economics. So these are the conclusion, and thank you very much. And I'll invite Kwame for the next part.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Vivian. So she's taken us through things. One, helped us to understand what price controls are, which is an economic policy instrument in which government decides to set a minimum price for the sale or exchange of goods or services, or a maximum price for the same. So it can work two ways, either minimum or a maximum by setting the price. Then she took us to what the legal instruments in Kenya are that enable price controls. And it's basically Essential Goods Price Control Act, basically for a number of them. And it showed us that most of those goods are either food or medicine and energy, all of which definitely are important essential commodities for household consumption, and which would then inspire the interest by government to ensure that their prices remain affordable. And then thirdly, went to the legal instruments that enable that and examined the law, asked ourselves whether the Constitution allows it, and it looks like the Constitution is silent in as much as it's a price consumer. It allows for consumer rights and a couple of other economic rights. Nowhere in the Constitution do we read that that is the basis for setting price controls, though that is sometimes implied in commentaries that we see. And then after coming out from that, we go to the empirical part, which is to ask ourselves, what does economic theories say would happen under a price controlled regime, regardless of the good or the service? And it tells you that the essential thing is that price control does two things. One, it changes the quantity of goods and services that is consumed. When the price control is below the equilibrium price, which is the price that would obtain without the restriction, when it is below that, then it means that it takes away the incentive for suppliers to present that good. So while the price remains low, what then does happen is that the amount of goods produced is much, much less, and therefore that results in a shortage, because producers are not going to produce a price below, not produce goods or services at a price that is below what they can use. What provides an incentive? Producers are not going to come to a market and produce and sell a good over which they either make losses or which does not give them a profit or return that they expect. That might lead them to switch to another area or fail to produce altogether. So while a price control gives the impression that you'll actually help you'll help consumers, what it does do eventually is actually reduces output. But that's what Vivian called the deadweight loss. On the other hand, when you have a price control mechanism, a price that is set above the market price, which is basically above the market price, the effect of that is that it provides an incentive for more production, because producers see a higher price and would like to produce. On the other hand, it squeezes the affordability of the same good for the demand side. And by that, it reduces how much can be bought, while at the same time increases how much is produced. That results in a glut, which is basically a surplus. So a price control in either circumstance, whether it is above the price that would obtain without the distortion, without that law, or whether it is below or whether it is above, leads to loss and leads to inefficient market outcomes. On one side, shortages, and on the other side, surplus, all of which lead to the waste of resources. But obviously, that's basically the theory. Then Vivian takes us to the empirical part and starts with other countries. With Kenya, and you've seen the prices that are true. Yes, so certainly the Minister for Finance has rights or has legal authority based on the statute that she mentioned, which allows for the control of prices for fuel and other things. And in fuel, we have the Energy, Petroleum and Regulatory Authority, which is supposed to set a specific price. Now, many people think that's not price setting. There's a formula through which that price is set, and that formula is then imposes a price upon which no dealer for fuels in Kenya may go beyond. So that basically is a price ceiling. And so we've seen a couple of things that happens. Whenever that price ceiling is in place and people anticipate that the price will rise, then the first thing that happens is you see hoarding, which is one of the things that we've had over a couple of weeks back. But on the other hand, we've seen, especially for food, and she gave the example of maize flour in Kenya. That's happened obviously to rice and wheat as well, but maize flour specifically, what tends to happen is when you have that, during election periods, when of course the political pressure is real, so politicians and the state itself is responding to real political pressure, then impose price controls, and they impose price controls that are artificially low. And the first thing that happens is you see Kenyans lining up to buy maize flour in supermarkets and in shops, but also rationing by supermarkets saying, look, you can only take 1 or 2 bags or whatever number, but there's a limit. So at the same time, it interferes with private choice about how much to sell and how much may be bought. So those we've seen. And then we go also to other examples that she gave in the US. The US has a bunker in which cheese is stored. I think she gave the history, which was basically sometime in the early 80s. There was a shock in the US. The dairy industry was not, had a shock. The government came in to help them by providing a subsidy for the production of milk. There was a glut. Then they converted that milk to cheese, and the government of Kenya buys cheese. The government of the US buys cheese every year in order to keep that industry afloat. But basically what you see is that an economic policy responding to a crisis of one time in the early 80s has been maintained for 40 years now and close to 50 years. So telling you how sticky and how why price controls are not necessarily a good mechanism, right? Regardless of whether they pay above or pay beyond. But the most important thing is a price control or anything that determines surpluses or shortages then has an effect on both the demand and the supply side. And then goes all the way to other countries in Spain, in France, potatoes in India, where price controls or minimum prices. So price controls can come in the form of minimum support prices or minimum prices, which we've had in Kenya as well. They tend to affect agricultural produce. And the political economy of it, of course, is these farmers everywhere tends to be very organized. They have political and voting pressure. The state responds to that, or governments respond to that. And then that leads to an equilibrium of prices that are wasteful. And you have harvests that are huge, government stores, but at the same time, you have people who are suffering from food. So it's not something that ensures that consumers actually benefit, even though most of the sensible arguments for price control are well-meaning, which is to make sure that goods are affordable on one side, or to make sure that farmers or producers get an adequate return. Whichever way it is, it usually has these consequences, none of which is efficient, obviously also sometimes disastrous. And then we came back to Kenya as well, in which Vivian gave us an example about 2014 or some time, when we know how the maize industry works in Kenya. Government subsidizes inputs. The largest farmers have huge surpluses. Government buys maize at prices high above what it is by putting a minimum price for maize. There's a glut. The National Cereals and Produce Board buys more than it can store. Every year, because the same incentives exist, more maize has to come in, storage is inadequate, the maize is destroyed. About 500,000 bags were destroyed in that year. Close to 600,000 bags were destroyed in that year, showing you once again that this happened in a year in which, in fact, Kenya had a drought and in which food prices were elevated. So that tells you about this. And then she concludes with the fact that, look, what government should do is let prices be. And if you wish to support people, you can do two things. On the demand side, find the most vulnerable households, which are affected by the price of fuel, the price of all those goods, and support them through fiscal policy. That's on the demand side. Leave prices alone, let prices be, because it performs a function which Vivian told us, enables households to buy, but at the same time gives the right incentives for the production side. That's one. If government wishes to support farmers, then extension services inputs could be allowed, but extension services that improves farmer productivity is superior to setting price controls. So basically, that's it, telling us that in the end, regardless of the fact that price controls are argued and well-meaning, you want to make sure that access to essential goods and services are available to all households on the one side. On the producer side, you want to ensure that farmers get an adequate return. when you set those price controls, people must be aware that you're shifting incentives in the market. And some of the results that we've seen cannot speak well what price control policy should be. Therefore confirms that what economic theory says and the empirical basis here suggests that price controls are not just an inefficient tool, but a tool that fails to perform the functions that are that justify the introduction to begin with. Now, sorry, I did a long, I got excited, I did a very long summary, but I'd like to open up now for all of us to ask questions. So if you have questions, you could do three things. Either you can send it into the chat box or question and answer, or raise your hand using the toolbar. I'll ask you to state your name. And if you have a question, you can ask your question. I already see a name up, and that is, yes, Emmanuel Munyasi. So Emmanuel, please switch on your mic and then ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwame and Vivian, for that insightful presentation. I have a comment and a question. If you look around, particularly in Africa, I think most governments have adopted price control in the energy sector. I've listened to the advantages that you listed, particularly when it comes to consumer protection. I wonder why it's difficult for governments to adopt this. What are the challenges of respecting the price mechanism as you have advised? And is there any country in Africa that actually has completely deregulated the energy sector that we can use maybe as an example? Then the next one is on the theory part of it. I noted Vivian has indicated that the circumstances under which we can justify government intervention, and I've seen monopolies are listed there. I wanted to give an example of our oil sector. It's not a monopoly, so to speak. I think it would be more accurate to describe it as an oligopolistic market. Obviously, in that kind of market, price mechanism does not work as effectively as economic theory would like it to be. What kind of interventions should the government have in such a market without instituting price control? My point is, respecting the price mechanism in an oligopoly will not lead to efficient outcomes. Otherwise, thank you for the presentation.
Okay, thanks a lot, Emmanuel. Yes, these are good questions. Does anyone else have a couple of questions, or one question or a comment for Vivian before we can take the asker to respond to them? Any other questions? Let me see whether there's any in the chat. Okay, I haven't seen any. So thanks, Emmanuel. So we'll, Vivian, please respond to Emmanuel's questions, and then we'll take a second round of questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So I need to confirm some of the countries that do not use price control on fuel prices. But one fact we need to make there is that even if something may be popular, does not mean that it is right. It may be used by a couple of governments for longest years possible, but that does not justify it to be economically right. And we have seen how that applies. Then also, the reason why sometimes letting the markets be sometimes may be tough is because we've seen the political incentives. Because people are complaining that the goods are unaffordable. So affordability issue. So sometimes tend to make the government want to intervene with having in their mind that now when we intervene, we are protecting consumers. But we have seen that it has more damages than the assumed benefit that they say it brings, or they claim it brings. So we have realized that price control is not consumer protection. And we have also seen that it is always mistaken by most governments that the only way we can protect consumers is when we control prices. But you have explained very well how some of the three mechanisms that can be used to protect consumers without really touching the prices of goods and services. And we have seen those are both on the supply and the demand side. So price mechanism, what governments or what people get wrong is that we want to protect our consumers. They have made a request that prices or goods are unaffordable. Now we touch the prices. But that is not the way out. You have given some alternatives that can be used by governments to ensure that prices are, that consumers are protected without necessarily touching on the prices. So maybe I can invite Kwame if you have another comment on that.
Okay. Yes, okay. So Emmanuel, thanks for your question. Yes. I think you asked two questions. The first question that you asked was whether which countries have a fully liberalized markets. And that's a good question because actually the first country that you can mention is Nigeria. Nigeria had price controls and also subsidies at the same time, up to until I think 3 years ago when President Tinubu was elected. And if you remember, there were shortages in Nigeria to the extent that when people were going to when people were going to travel sometimes out of the country, they'd have to start lining up outside fuel stations 48 hours in advance to make sure that they're able to drive from that place straight to the airport or come back. Sometimes it was really, really serious because petroleum was very, very cheap. And obviously there's a problem. In addition to other supply problems, obviously in Nigeria. So Nigeria liberalized both, the fuel and at the same time liberalize the foreign exchange market all at the same time. Shock therapy in the energy markets. Now, what you see now is people can argue whether it should have done in that sequence or not, but the fact is the government had considered it and decided to go about it in that way. And remember, they've maintained it. Here is a country that itself is a producer of petroleum fuels. So Nigeria is one. The other one is Zambia. Zambia has fully liberalized fuel markets. Remember, it also is not a producer, so it simply decided after some time that this was not worthy. Ghana too is one of them. One as well that has a fully liberalized market. So I confine myself to sub-Saharan African countries in which that happens. We also have Uganda. Uganda too does have it actually. Uganda doesn't control petroleum prices, even though it has much lower. And that's why fuel is cheaper in Uganda than it is in Kenya, in spite of the fact that some of it passes through Kenya on trucks or through the pipeline as it goes back the other way. And that is by keeping lower fuel costs. Prices of taxes. So yes, we have a good number of countries that have done that. And if you assess those markets for themselves, they haven't done badly. Nigeria's case is still being written, but on the whole, you don't have people lining up now. Fuel might be more expensive than they would have preferred, but at the same time, it is available, which a pure consumer would say is perhaps preferable to having to line up. And as Vivian said, even if you're paying a lower cost, but you're lining up for 6 hours for which you don't work, the opportunity cost is the work that you'd have done. And if you top up that amount with the amount that you're paying for the fuel, sometimes the price probably comes to the same, or a fuel controlled price is even worse than what the alternative would have been. So there are hidden forms of payment that you make. So I hope those examples are sufficient. Other parts of the world, of course, have it, but I wanted to give African countries. And it's essential that I gave one, Nigeria, which has had oil for 60 years, Ghana, which has had oil for about 15 years now, Zambia, which doesn't have any, which would be comparable to Kenya. So I think that's useful. Vivian, you had a second question from Emmanuel, which is basically that the oil market is an oligopolistic market. So what are the ways that government can use to justify, what kind of interventions will government use to ensure that consumer welfare is protected? Do you want to go ahead and answer that before we go for our second round of questions?
Okay, thank you. So when we looked at some of the ways or instances when the government should intervene is only when the market is monopoly. So a market that is oligopoly, the government is not allowed to intervene when it comes to price control. So Maybe allow me to look into that more, as then I give a response later.
Okay, fine, but I could help you. So you're right, Emmanuel. One of the things is that, yes, oil markets have a different character, especially for countries that are where you are importing. I mean, most of it is imported. And there's it tends to be transnational corporations sometimes. The biggest generally are transnational corporations, right? But in Kenya, we also have corporations that are domestic in the sense that it is also a very capital intensive market. And oil farms have been found in other parts of the world. It's claimed in Kenya as well. There's not been much evidence, but it's claimed that sometimes they collude to set prices. In fact, the idea for the price control of oil markets came from an investigation that was done by the Monopolies and Prices, the Competition Authority. They did not find evidence of collusion, but nevertheless, Parliament went ahead and imposed price controls, believing that these firms were gouging. In other words, price gouging, making Kenyans having pay more than would be a fair wage. I mean, what more than would be a fair price. So how does government respond to that? Just like many other countries do, it's true. It's an industry that is very capital intensive. Some of those firms cooperate and they are available in the same markets. Sometimes they even have staff who've worked among one another. So those connections might exist. The social networks that they have are real. But one of the ways to do that is to ensure first, from a regulatory function, yes, that diagnosis sometimes leads people to say that because these people know each other and they're trading the same product and selling it at different prices, or sometimes trying to do that, we should impose price controls. We've tried to persuade you that price controls are not very efficient and not useful, even if they're a very politically important tool. So that's one. The second option, and which we think is a superior one, is economic regulation. As Vivian showed, monopolies or incomplete competition is one of the reasons, one of the justifications that allows for government to intervene in markets. So how would government use the monopolies law or the competition law to ensure that there's no collusion? Collusion should be punished very severely. And so if you allow the competition authority in Kenya, which I think is adequately competent, has resource persons, they could get other resources, to be honest, to allow them to engage. They could actually monitor markets very, very closely. And in other parts of the world, South Africa as well, and in other places where collusion in setting prices or determining markets, because collusion could take many places, right? To affect prices, you can affect consumers by deciding to distribute markets by saying you people work in only this part of Nairobi and the other guys work in that part of Nairobi, and therefore you monopolize specific areas. This geographical distribution or spatial distribution of markets artificially, those things can be investigated, and a competent competition authority would do that. And I think that would be a superior way to respond to that. A third form which people talk about is structural interventions. And this is one of the reasons why if you remember, Kenya used to have the National Oil Corporation. And the National Oil Corporation was supposed to be a strategic investor, which would be a firm owned by the government, operating on commercial principles, and its work is to ensure that it has significant market share, which allows it to dissipate or to blunt the possibility of collusion by the other firms. Now, we know that the story of National Oil Corporation of Kenya did not go too well. It had very low market share. It didn't perform as was required. So basically, those are some of the three things. So you can have a structural intervention, which is to have one firm also in the market, which is government. So you're doing two things. You're diversifying the market, but also allowing it through law to do strategic market operations, which would be if these other firms are trying to price gouge, and actually with government authority reduce its own margins and attract many more people. It can also have, in some cases, because of its position, privileged access to supplying government, for instance, and in other places. Not perfect systems, but yes. So as I said, those tools can also be made to work together. And that can actually make government efficiency to move it. Remember, we are not saying that perfect markets will be perfect, but you're saying a price determined in the market. When a farm knows that suppliers are competing with it, it will be more careful about trying to exploit the consumer than we need to. But also, government ought to remember that a market is comprised of both the suppliers and the consumers. And therefore, that's why a price mechanism should be light as much as possible. That's the most efficient one. So thank you. I'll open up to the next set of questions. I shouldn't be answering questions. This is Vivian's webinar. Do we have any other questions? Let me check. If you have any other questions, please raise your hands and I'll ask Vivian to respond to them. I'm not seeing any questions here. Any other? Okay. I see some of my colleagues from the Institute of Economic Affairs in our regulation program and all. So if you have a question, if you have something to add, please do before I come back to Vivian for final emphasis and also to close the meeting if we don't get any other questions. Anyone else from the IEA who has a comment? All right. Okay, looks like Vivian was very clear. So Vivian, you can make your final comments and actually any other thing that you'd like us to bear in mind, and then we'll close the meeting because it looks like our guests have no questions or comments about the presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. I thank you very much all for attending and participating. So I'll just conclude by saying that the objective of maybe the act may be right, but the mechanism is wrong. So it is right to protect consumers. It is okay to ensure the welfare of the consumers and even producers, but the mechanism of price control is a wrong one. So if the goal is truly to protect them, then the solution should not be price control, but to strengthen markets and the alternatives that we gave. Then the real question here is not basically whether or not the government should act, but how it can act without undermining the markets that sustain consumers. So the objective is very correct. We are not against protecting consumers, but the mechanism of price control is the wrong one. And if the policies can be adjusted to the recommendation, it can help rather than assuming that when you reduce or when you touch prices, you are protecting consumers. So that is the summary I'd like to give. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, thanks. Thank you very much, Vivian. So yes, I've seen, thanks, Emmanuel. Emmanuel is satisfied at least with the answers that Vivian gave and has asked us to send a copy of the presentation. Yes, as soon as this meeting is over, we will send a copy of the presentation. It will be available on our website and all of those who are here. If you send us your email or not, if you go to our presentation, the presentation bar on our website, you'll be able to find this presentation, say half an hour after this meeting. So that's one. The other is on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, I'd like to thank you all for attending this meeting. We hope that this has been a useful conversation for you, that you've gotten some nuggets or some insights. And we're grateful for the questions, even those that didn't come, but especially for Emmanuel for keeping the conversation by asking us to think more clearly about and to clarify the presentation that we made. So I'm grateful that you're all here. We'll have another set of webinars, so please be on. Please keep watching through our social media pages, but also just sending emails to the IEA events email so that we can clarify, we can alert you for any webinars of interest to you. As I said, the Institute of Economic Affairs is a professional organization with members, and if you wish to be a member, please send a word to an inquiry through our email address, admin@IEA Kenya, and we'll give you the details. That stated, as Vivian has stated, we are asking the question whether price controls are a good thing. We think it is an essential conversation to have at this moment where not only the globe, but also domestically for a country of Kenya's size, which faces pressures based on stuff that is not in our control, not in control of our government directly or otherwise. Kenyan farms are going to have to respond to changes in price of energy, and energy is a big part of Kenya's economy. It represents close to 10% of all GDP. So that's a really, really big sector. There are going to be substantial changes. It affects transportation and all that. But in addition to that, food as well. Whenever Kenya experiences a drought, the effect of that, of course, is a shock on the food prices. Food prices go up. And they're saying that protecting consumers or ensuring access to low-income households or farms at any time is a good policy goal. The instruments that are chosen tend to be those that are most politically potent or most politically showy, but their effectiveness in ensuring that they meet the specific requirement by households to receive access, be it to food, to energy, is one that is questioned, because both economic theory tells you that they will not be effective, and we have tried to give you evidence, not just in Kenya, but in other parts of the world, that price controls, whether they're above or whether they're below the equilibrium price, usually produce suboptimal outcomes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This is Holy Week, Monday, Thursday. Have a good Easter holiday, and we hope that we can have a conversation again in due course. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.